The Scottish Affairs Committee, and today we have the Scotland Office team led by our Secretary of State, Alister Jack. And Alister, Secretary of State, if you don't mind introducing yourself, your colleagues, and anything by way of a short introductory statement. Secretary of State.
Well, good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. I am, as always, delighted to appear before the Scottish Affairs Committee to update you of the work of the Scotland Office and the United Kingdom Government. And I'm joined this afternoon on my left by my colleague John Lamont, and to his left, Lawrence Rocky, who's Director of the Scotland Office, as you know, and hopefully in the next half an hour on my right by Lord Offord of Garvel, Malcolm Offord, who is our Minister in the House of Lords, as you know, and is currently taking questions in the House of Lords. So when that finishes, he'll be straight here. That's the plan. So since I last appeared before you in May, we've had a very, very busy period. The UK government continues to invest heavily in Scotland's communities and key industries. Since May, we've committed to more locally driven projects across Scotland, and that includes 6 more Levelling Up Fund projects, 4 new Levelling Up partnerships, and a funding boost for 7 towns in Scotland. Mr. Chairman, these announcements take the total UK government investment in levelling up in Scotland to £2.7 billion. We're dealing directly with local authorities. We're helping to ensure that funding supports local priorities and also local projects. Both the local authorities and the communities they serve have welcomed this investment and the jobs it will create with some enthusiasm. They've also welcomed direct engagement with the UK government, and I believe, as I've said before, this is real devolution in action. In addition, we've announced 2 investment zones for Glasgow and North East Scotland. Our investment zones programme, backed up by up to £160 million of funding per zone, has huge potential to turbocharge local economies. And like our Free Ports programme, we're making good progress on now on upgrading the A75, and it, along with Free Ports, along with investment zones, is a good example of the collaborative working between the UK and the Scottish governments. We also continue to support our oil and gas sector as we ensure our energy security and our transition to net zero. We have given the go-ahead for drilling to begin in Rosebank, the UK's biggest untapped oil field. We've backed a further 27 oil and gas licences, and we've committed to an annual round of new licensing. And the Prime Minister, during his visit to Scotland in July, announced that the Acorn project in St Fergus is one of 2 projects best placed to deliver the government's objectives under Track 2 of the Carbon Capture, Utilisation and Storage Scheme. And I should not need to remind the committee that all of this investment is on top of a record block grant funding settlement for Scotland. And that funding has just been boosted in the autumn statement by a further £545 million of Barnett consequentials. So I believe, Mr. Chairman, there can be no excuse if the Scottish Government struggles to balance its books when it sets its budget later this month, and that may be something that we return to. Mr. Chairman, I know this committee has taken a keen interest in the promotion of Scotland abroad. The UK Government's evidence to the committee and our response to your findings shows clearly our commitment to this. St Andrew's Day illustrated this beautifully as our High Commissions, our embassies, our consulates around the world organised a range of events that celebrated Scotland. And as Secretary of State, I've continued to work closely with the FCDO to ensure the Scottish Government is able to play an appropriate role in promoting Scotland overseas. Foreign affairs is reserved under the Scotland Act, and it's important for the UK, the United Kingdom, to speak on the world stage with one consistent voice. It is wholly unacceptable for the Scottish Government to promote foreign policies which are at odds with those of the United Kingdom Government. It risks causing confusion and it damages the UK's standing in the world. And Mr. Chairman, I would move on to the subject of exports and the efforts we've made to boost Scottish exports. And that's been greatly helped by new trade deals. Since May, we've ratified deals with Australia and New Zealand, and we've signed the Protocol of Accession to the CPTPP Trans-Pacific Trade Bloc. CPTPP will bring huge opportunities, especially for our food and drink sector. And I saw this myself during a recent trip to Vietnam, where sales of Scotch whisky, everyone will be pleased to hear, have already increased 4-fold and are still growing. Finally, Mr. Chairman, may I note that since May, we've marked the 25th anniversary of the Royal Assent for the Scotland Act in 1998. I know the committee has taken a close interest in the workings of devolution, even though, as I've said before, nationalists do not necessarily support devolution because they actively seek to destroy it. But as Secretary of State for Scotland, it is my job to uphold the devolution settlement and to ensure it operates as it should. And that is why I acted to block the Scottish Government's gender recognition legislation, which would have had an adverse effect on the GB-wide Equalities Act. And I was pleased, very pleased, that the Court of Session in Edinburgh found in my favour and confirmed that Section 35 is an integral part of the devolution settlement. Upholding that settlement is a role I take incredibly seriously, and I will continue to do so. And with those remarks, I will conclude, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you ever so much for your very concise opening remarks and setting the scene, I think you cover most of the issues that we'll certainly be wanting to ask you about in terms of this session. And I'll deal with a couple of points that you mentioned in your introductory statement, because I think they're the most relevant and probably the most interesting to the committee, and that is, as you rightly identified, the use of the Section 35 and the further letter that we saw from the Foreign Secretary yesterday issued to the Scottish Government. And firstly, I could tell that you're not just pleased, but really pleased about the outcome of the Court of Session.
Yes.
I wonder, does that encourage you to think possible more uses of Section 35?
No.
No, not at all. No, you wouldn't be tempted now that you've found that this is an instrument that could obviously be utilised in the form of, like if there's legislation you don't like, things you might disagree with, that you feel that you might just reach for that power to...
Well, it's interesting you make the point. It's not an unfettered power, as the judgment made clear. It's been used once in nearly 350 acts that have gone to royal assent. It's alongside the power of Section 33, which is for legislation that's out with competence. In this case, Section 35, which sits in the Act, is for legislation that has adverse effects. It's the first time that the law officers have judged that to be the case, and obviously, as a result, I didn't hesitate to use it. But I think if the Scottish Government make good legislation, listen to the advice of their law officers, don't go out with the competence or don't create adverse effects within the United Kingdom, I see no reason for us to, go to court again. But if the boundaries are being pushed, then it is right that the law officers advise my position as Secretary of State to act, and I will always act if that's the case. But I can tell you, as we look out now and the sort of future time frame of legislation that's coming forward, I don't see anything currently in the advice that I've got in front of me that would lead us to returning to court, thank goodness.
Well, that's reassuring, and I think the Scottish Government will be listening very keenly and intently to what you say about the future use of Section 35. And I think Lady Haldane made it entirely and abundantly clear this is a matter for you, isn't it? Entirely your judgment when it comes to certain things. I just wonder, like with the Section 35 on the GRR bill, had you been the Secretary of State under Theresa May's government, would you similarly have evoked Section 35?
Yes.
You definitely would have, even though that was the intention of the UK government. Because you'll remember back in 2019, the manifesto commitments, the programme for government was that the UK government would legislate for the whole of the United Kingdom. You would still use Section 35 about a specific act in the Scottish Parliament when it came to GRR reform there.
Due to the adverse effects of the GB-wide Equalities Act, I would have used Section 35, whoever the Prime Minister was. Right,
so it would have made no difference whatsoever if the UK government were intending to legislate in that field in area.
Well, no, I mean, intending to legislate doesn't butter any parsnips. That you have to deal with the law as the law is at the time. Legislation that may be coming may not come, as we know. Not all legislation that's promised happens, as we all know. You deal with the legislation in front of you, and you deal with the law as it exists at the time, and that's why I'd have taken the decision I took in any of those circumstances, because the advice I would have would be this is causing confusion, an adverse effect with GB-wide legislation, and that's what it's there for, Section 35. It's very important to understand that it's there to protect devolution. It's there to strengthen devolution. The Scotland Act has it there, voted for by MPs of all parties back in 1998. The SNP MPs voted for it as well. It is there so that when legislation is produced by passed by any devolved administration that cuts across legislation on a UK or GB-wide basis, we are then able to stop it. So I think it's a perfectly sensible. And actually, can I just say, because it is Lady Haldane did note that far from being an impermissible intrusion upon the constitutional settlement. Section 35 is an intrinsic part of it, and that's really the point I want to make.
I did note that, and you're absolutely right. But I'm just wondering, like, you've dealt with Section 35, you don't foresee any situation where you would be in a position where you might reach for it again, certainly towards the end. And you're shaking your head.
I don't see, on the legislation we see coming forward, and often I've been asked why we didn't fix the legislation before we got to that point. Yeah. And the answer is that there were many, many amendments at Stage 2 and Stage 3 of the bill, and some of those amendments may have changed had they been accepted by the Scottish Government.
We won't go over the history of the passing of the Act and some of the consultation.
I just want you to know that,
I'm just wondering, like, you've laid Section 35 aside, but you've other provisions which are at your disposal to deal with pieces of legislation that you don't particularly like passed by the Scottish Government. And you have the provisions under the Internal Market Act, for example. Yeah. And of course, the deposit return scheme fell foul of your considerations at that. Would you be tempted to use some of the powers that you have at your disposal, maybe to deal with other matters in the Scottish Parliament that you didn't like?
Well, the deposit return scheme, which you refer to, was very, over 1,000 businesses wrote to us and explained the damage it was doing to their business model, particularly craft breweries and small retailers and many others. And it was a very badly crafted piece of a plan. It was a plan that was copying the one Jacinda Ardern had in New Zealand that then was junked by the next Prime Minister. He dumped it because it wasn't working. I do think a deposit return scheme can work, but I think the one that was planned was not going to work. And
would you use powers that you have available?
So where I have to use the power is where within the UK internal market you don't have seamless trade. And a very good example, I want to make one small example of where the deposit return scheme went wrong. And Ken Murphy, the chief executive of Tesco, made this point on behalf of all the online retailers. All of them united in the article he put in the Grocer, which said that anything that was recyclable, the responsibility was on them to get all those goods back and pay the deposit to the elderly, the infirm, the disabled, those in rural areas without a car, without et cetera, et cetera. And he said, we can't do that, so we won't sell any of those products online anymore to those people. And do you see the point I'm making? Because the onus was on them to then take those products back to get their money back from a vending machine. And so that alone was damaging the retail industry.
I'm less interested in the mechanics of the deposit.
Well, I'm explaining what the UK internal market does.
You explained it very clearly. What I'm trying to ascertain is whether you would be tempted to use provisions that you have under your powers with the Internal Market Act to deal with pieces of legislation. Like, I'm thinking mainly, like, farmers in my constituency are a bit concerned about the agricultural bill in the Scottish Parliament. It may give Scottish farmers some sort of competitive advantage across the United Kingdom. Would you, as the Secretary of State, intervene to say, no, we can't have this impacts on the internal market across the United Kingdom, and possibly reach for these powers to ensure that couldn't happen? Would you do that?
The Internal Market Act is underpinned by the principles of mutual recognition and non-discrimination. Those are the principles that underpin the internal market within the single market within the EU. And what we want within the UK, and it's critically important for Scotland because 61% of our trade is with the rest of the UK, is we want seamless trade across the United Kingdom, so our businesses are not put at a disadvantage.
Would you be tempted to use the powers?
As I was going to say, so I believe the bar. I mean, these are ongoing issues all the time. We're in discussion with the Scottish Government about these things all the time, about what should be excluded, what shouldn't be. I think the bar for exclusions has to be incredibly high. But if the Scottish Government want to, for instance, one of the live issues at the moment is glue traps for rodents. If the Scottish Government want to ban the sale of glue traps, they can do that. If they want to ban the use of glue traps, they can do that. They don't need an exclusion from the Internal Market Act.
Glue traps are safe. Yeah.
Well, no. They can ban the sale and use of them if they want to. It doesn't mean the rest of the UK has to do that. And under mutual recognition, what it means is if you have a business in Glasgow that imports glue traps from somewhere else, made in Wales, for sake of argument, and you then sell them to a Norway or Norwegian business or Iceland, it's important to note this. You can still carry on that trade. But what you can't do is sell them in Scotland, and people can't buy them in Scotland to use them in Scotland, and therefore the Internal Market Act works. You're not liking my answers very much because they're all common sense.
Business, if we can, if that's all right.
Sorry.
And I'm trying to get answers to you for questions that we want to put to you. So what we're trying to get here is like the arrangements and provisions that you have at hand to overturn acts or pieces of legislation passed by the Scottish Parliament. And the way you describe it there is that you set yourself up almost like some sort of self-styled referee, an honest broker, an arbiter.
Yeah. Well, so the UK
role is the referee and arbiter of legislation that's passed through the Scottish Parliament.
No. That's completely wrong. Regarding Section 3 and Section 35, we take the advice of the law officers, and that's what anyone in my position has to do. Regarding the UK Internal Market Act, the UK government, and Lord Offord has joined us now, he has a role within Department of Business and Trade relating to the UK Internal Market Act. The UK Internal Market Act exists to maintain seamless trade across the UK, so there isn't unnecessary divergence. That's what it's there to do. It's to protect businesses, which protects jobs and protects trade. Okay. And that's all it's there to do. And so the decisions we take, you say we're the arbiter, it is the case that the UK government, ultimately through the Office of the Internal Market, will take those decisions, and that's why the Office of the Internal Market was set up.
Thank you. Can we move on to because last time you were here we discussed your unhappiness about Scottish Government in terms of how it was communicating to international governments. You gave us a list of what you assumed and said were transgressions, and of course we're all very much aware of the letter that was seen from the Foreign Secretary issued to the Scottish Government today, which actually
yesterday morning.
Yesterday morning it was. You're absolutely right. Where there is now an added threat that what he's seeking to do is to entirely block the Scottish Government from having these type of meetings and arrangement, and has even said that he's of a view to turf the Scottish Government out of UK Embassy and High Commission's building. And this is even when the Scottish Government has said they'd be more than happy for a UK official to attend these meetings. Are you seriously going to follow through on this threat?
So to be very the Foreign Secretary's letter, which I was cited on and fed into, I support it 100%. I think there's a very simple principle here. All ministers in the United Kingdom, irrespective of their ministers in a devolved administration or the UK government, when they're overseas, when they meet ministers from foreign countries, they must have, and this is the protocol for all of us, they must have an official, a civil servant from the Foreign Office present to take notes. So there could be no confusions. Well, the Scottish Government don't accept that because the reason the 16th of October letter was sent by James Cleverly, which may not have come into the public domain, made it very clear that they resisted that on the First Minister's meeting with the Icelandic Prime Minister. And that's why the first letter went on the 16th of October. This follow-up letter is because the First Minister, in COP, in his agenda, chose to meet someone who the UK government didn't believe should be met, which was the President of Turkey, Erdogan. You know the story. You know there. The warning to the Foreign Office was given very last minute. There wasn't time for the Foreign Office official to get there, but there was time for the First Minister to get there. So they must have known about the meeting a little bit more in advance. But it wasn't the only offence. No. I must make this point because you're making out it was a one-off. There was without Foreign Office officials present, there was a meeting with Ursula von der Leyen, Charles Michel, the Prime Minister of Lebanon, and the acting Prime Minister of Pakistan. So there were 5 different occasions where meetings happened with foreign ministers without an official from. And it's not complicated. If there aren't to be any sanctions, all the Scottish Government have to do is take Foreign Office officials to their meetings. That's all we're asking, which is incumbent on me and every other minister in the United Kingdom, and everyone else seems to be able to do it.
What the First Minister says, the meeting with Erdogan, which you reference, I don't think the other meetings which you mentioned are
another 4.
Well, not in the Lord Cameron's letter.
No, but that's because I kept them up my sleeve for you today, Mr. Chairman.
The pertinent meeting, what is said is The First Minister said it was rearranged at short notice by the President's team. The FCDO office chose not to stay with the Scottish delegation the whole day.
I heard that.
And because of that, they ended up missing the meeting. Do you accept
that? I heard that. And
you don't accept it?
Well, as Her Majesty once said, recollections may vary. What I would say is this. I've heard directly from the Foreign Office what they feel happened. And I've also added another 4, which I kept fresh for you today.
Will you give details of this to the committee?
Well, you don't need details for the committee. All you need to do is go to the First Minister's X or Twitter, or whatever they call it these days, account, and they're all there, photographic evidence. Enjoy it at your leisure.
Surely it's the nature of these international meetings.
No, that's not how the rules work. There is a protocol
that the Scottish Government rearranged these meetings with these people that you say are now going to be included in further correspondence.
There will be no further correspondence. There will be no. You're putting words into my mouth. There will be no further correspondence. The correspondence is there. It's very clear. The Scottish Government, if they want to have facilitation and logistical support and everything else overseas, then they must have an official from the Foreign Office present at those meetings. That is incumbent, and that is incumbent upon all ministers from the United Kingdom, irrespective of they're a minister in a devolved administration or they're a minister for the United Kingdom government. Those are the rules. And all we're asking is that they stick to the rules that everyone else sticks to. It's not complicated, and it shouldn't be that difficult.
And just lastly, so you are serious about this threat to withdraw Scottish Government officials from UK embassies and High Commissions? That's a serious and live threat that you've put forward, yeah?
Well, it's very clear in the letter.
That's fine. Now, what we've done, we've decided we'd split the time equally amongst members. I started my time at 5 past to 20 past. So it's now, we now started at 5 past. Mr Ross, thank you ever so much for helping us out with the timekeeping arrangements once again. So we now move on to Wendy Chamberlain. Wendy.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'm confident I will not take up my time. Good to see you all today, gentlemen. So my first question is that the IGR framework, which was set up in January 2022 to make intergovernmental relations work a bit easier, the first meeting, or the main meeting that's supposed to take place from that, is the Prime Minister and Heads of Devolved Government Council, which is supposed to meet annually. I know the Prime Minister is busy at the moment, but it last met in November 2022. Can you tell me when the next meeting is due to be, Secretary of State?
So Lawrence is going to take the IGR staff.
Lovely. Thank you, Mr Rocky.
Hi, Wendy. Nice to be here. So there's not a date in the diary. You're right that the IGR review committed to have one meeting a year. I think we might miss that, but the government's completely committed to IGR. You see only one of the subcommittees not taking place. We've got a huge amount of business throughout the year. In addition, I'd also say that the Prime Minister meets with the heads of devolved governments regularly in addition to this forum. So certainly we'd be keen to have that meeting in due course. As you say, there's a lot of things going on at the moment, but I expect we can look forward to seeing the meeting in the new year.
It just feels that that's the meeting at the top of the pyramid, and then when we look further down, following January 2022's review, that there's a lot of things that aren't happening regularly, and we're back to that ad hoc situation. And I think that's certainly something that's a concern to me, and I'll wait to hear what others in the committee think. But I think one of the challenges is that the framework was set up and I've got this here in my notes, describes a new era for intergovernment relations and a commitment by the 4 administrations to maintaining positive and constructive relations based on mutual respect for the responsibility of the governments. Do we think that's one of the challenges in terms of why the new framework isn't working, that there's a lack of mutual respect?
I don't agree it's not working.
Okay.
I think you see a huge amount of progress. I was at IMG EFRA, so that's the one with Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. Recently, you see a lot of positive, constructive dialogue. So obviously there's a top-down view, but there's also a bottom-up, and you're seeing on any kind of bureaucratic level, 17 subcommittees is quite a lot, and I think you see a huge amount of collaboration across the government. I also think if you see just the sheer amount of good work that's happening between civil servants at civil service level. Good recent examples would be the work that we're doing on the energy space, looking at the Windsor review of how you speed up the changes to national grid. You're seeing really excellent collaboration between civil servants. So Of course, we'd like perhaps some more meetings in certain areas, but I think overall it's working. But clearly, it exists in a political backdrop. Sorry.
It's one of the challenges that the civil servant meetings aren't necessarily seen. I suppose, Michael Gove said that there needs to be a regular tempo. No matter how things appear to be working, do we accept that there isn't a regular tempo, or certainly not a visible one?
Can I come in?
Minister.
Well, thanks for having me here. I mean, the interministerial groups I'm involved in, my experience of them during the year I've done this job has been very, very positive, particularly around EFRA and on welfare, which is, as you will understand, particularly sensitive and important that we get the transfer of additional welfare powers to the Scottish Government correct, and the workings of that group in particular have been useful, and it's not grabbing the headlines, but it is constructive in achieving the outcome which both governments want, and that's us working collaboratively together. But out with the formal structure of the inter-ministerial groups, you see, for example, at a call last week with Neil Gray, the Cabinet Secretary, around the situation at Grangemouth, and that's an example of together with the council leader, and that's us working together out with, again, the formal structure, but achieving a joint approach in terms of a challenge which both governments are facing. You see with the Seafood Action Group, again, not formally an inter-ministerial group, but an example of us working together. And I think what our constituents want us to see is both governments working collaboratively together, and not necessarily seeing conflict.
No, absolutely. But on Grangemouth, it did feel like that caught everybody on the hop, didn't it? I suppose my point is if we had that sort of regular drumbeat of meetings, potentially that sort of environmental scanning might have taken place, and both governments might be in better place to respond.
Well, in relation to Grangemouth, I think having spoken to the council leader and Neil Gray and speaking to the officials here within the UK government, I think that announcement caught everybody off the hop. I don't think any extra meetings would have changed that. The outcome now is ensuring that the workforce there and the wider community, who are clearly very anxious about what is potentially coming down the line, get the support that they need, and whatever interventions this government can make to try and support that community, that they are made at an early opportunity.
I know, Minister Lamont, what you said there about the EFRA meetings, and indeed the Chair mentioned the Scottish Agricultural Bill or policy that's been brought forward, and it is good to see that number of meetings. But I suppose just selfishly looking at it from a North East Fife perspective, if I look at higher education or tourism, for example, both of which are very important in my constituency, there's been no meetings under those subcommittees. That doesn't feel great. Would you accept that?
I mean, there's a range of interministerial groups which will be up and running in due course. I mean, it's important that we prioritise those areas that need to be accelerated. And as I say, those meetings which have been involved in, the discussions we've had with the Scottish Government and the engagement between officials have been very, very positive.
I suppose for me, we're 2 years on, and it's great to hear that those meetings are so positive, but it does feel that there's policy areas where they're not getting the same opportunity. The other one I just wanted to pick up was health. I mean, obviously, COVID is back at the forefront again with the COVID inquiry taking place. Is that not a concern, Secretary of State? Is that not a concern that the health group has not met since January 2022? Mr Rocky, you're looking to come in.
So I can write to confirm that the situation, but my understanding is the health one has now met, perhaps since you have that information. Okay. We're only one that hasn't met, so
okay.
Progress on that.
Because that's obviously something that surely we don't need a COVID inquiry Scotland or UK level to know that preparedness for a future pandemic and working together will be very important.
I agree, but if I may, I think you have seen through the pandemic, a huge amount of collaboration between the health services in Scotland and in England and in Wales. So I think more IMG meetings is a good thing, but it is not an end in itself. There's lots of collaboration that goes along in addition.
Okay, so I think accepting more work to do, and I'm looking forward to hearing when the Prime Minister and Council group will take place. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you. Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much. If I could just briefly go back to something that the Secretary of State said in his statement. He talked about levelling up and the £2.7 billion in total that's been spent. And we've just been hearing... Billion. Did I say million? I do beg your pardon. The 2.7 billion that's been spent. And key to what Secretary of State was talking about was the free ports. Grangemouth is an integral part of the fourth free port. And there's now speculation about the future of Edinburgh Airport, that it may be sold. What steps is the government taking to ensure that it's speaking to the Scottish Government and collaborating in the way we've just been talking about that Freeport specifically, and to ensure it's not undermined?
I'm happy to. We can both.
Well, if I may, I mean, we have had discussions around that. The decision around Grangemouth in itself, or the potential decision on Grangemouth, we do not believe will impact on the Freeport status. But as I say, on the back of the discussions I've had with the council leader in Falkirk and the Cabinet Secretary Neil Gray, we are prepared to make whatever decisions we can to help that community. But the decision itself does not affect the Freeport status.
And if I can add, I mean, we actually think the Freeport status will help Grangemouth, and help the challenge regarding jobs. My initial concern around the refinery was what impact it might have on the Acorn project, carbon capture, utilisation, storage. But I was relieved to discover that actually that wasn't. It's the move to blue hydrogen, and it's the creation of the blue hydrogen. That's the carbon that was being captured and sent back up the Fergus pipeline to Peterhead to be then put back into the rock strata of the North Sea. So it hasn't undermined. I'm pleased to report it has not undermined the CCUS project either, but it was a worry.
Thank you. I wanted to move on to the current practice of Scottish ministers giving evidence to UK Parliament committees like this one, and what assessment any of you, yourself, Secretary of State, but also Lord Offord and Mr Lamont, what your assessment is of the current practice, both of Scottish ministers coming here to parliamentary committees, but of UK ministers giving evidence at Holyrood.
Well,
is it efficient?
Well, select committees will always think it's never enough, won't they? But I mean, there's a huge amount of pressure on our time. I have always made myself available. I think the Chairman would acknowledge this to come to this committee, and I believe this is the committee that I answer to. Mm-hmm. And I think that's important. And I think what's most important is that ministers who are responsible to a committee make themselves available to that committee, and that committee can scrutinise them. I think that's the piece that is really important here. I mean, I know, when the former First Minister did Loose Women that morning or that Monday, you had asked her to be here that day answering to the Scottish Affairs Committee. And when she was questioned on it, she said, I don't answer to them, I answer to the Scottish Parliament. I don't actually take that approach, just to be clear. But it was disappointing that in all the time she was First Minister, she'd never appeared in front of this committee. I would go back to the former, bar a few, Prime Minister, Lord Cameron, then David Cameron. He did offer to appear in front of the Scottish Parliament every year and answer questions, and that offer was turned down for some reason. I don't know why, but it was. I mean, he was very clear about that he offered to go in front of the Scottish Parliament. So people have different reasons why they want to see different people in front of committees, but I believe my responsibility is to appear in front of this committee.
Okay. Do you think it might improve the relationship? We've heard a lot about the relationship, the difficulty with meetings, the difficulty with the Foreign Office and Scottish ministers and having officials with them. Do you think it would go a long way to improving the relationship between the governments if ministers did make themselves, other than yourself, ministers did make themselves more available to select committees and to Holyrood?
I think so, but I think as I go back to this, I mean, I know there are time constraints. I suspect that there seems to have been a trend to go back to appearing as we are today in person, and that is obviously the preferred outcome. Possibly a better way of dealing with this going forward between, whether it's Wales or Scotland or Westminster, would be to offer the appearances to be online, go back to what we learned during COVID. That's just an idea, because I think there's an awful lot, it takes a lot of time out of someone's, to travel down here, to appear in front of a committee for an hour and a half, to then travel back is a day away, and maybe online might be a better solution to offer it that way. I don't know.
Lord Offord, do you want to?
I mean, I've never been invited. So, I mean, I'd love to go to Holyrood. I asked for a pass and was told I wasn't allowed one. But I would happily go, because in the area that I cover, trade, for example, I've just been down in Australia working on the FTA, the Australian trade deal, which is going to be a massive benefit of Brexit. Okay? Now, in this particular case, the SNP group voted against that deal. And yet I know that the utilisation team from the Australian embassy went to Hollywood to brief them, and they loved the deal. So I'd quite like to be up there to explain to them why this is a great deal and why they should vote for it. But I've not yet been invited.
Can I add? I mean, I agree with the Secretary of State's comments. I mean, the job of the Select Committees here is to hold UK Government Ministers to account. The job of committees in the Scottish Parliament is to hold Scottish Government Ministers to account. And as somebody who's spent 10 years in the Scottish Parliament, I think it's a fair point to make. I don't think the committee structure in the Scottish Parliament works all that well in terms of holding the Scottish Government to account. And I think the job of the Scottish Government Committee should be holding the Scottish Government Ministers to account and not being distracted by trying to pull UK Government Ministers up to Holyrood.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have a particular difficulty.
Forgot we had a local expert, Chairman.
And welcome, Lord Offord, to the committee. We saw you coming in there. No, not at all. We have a particular difficulty in this committee because we span Scottish and UK government reserved and devolved responsibilities. And there's a numerous amount of invitations that we give to Scottish Government Ministers to come down there. Some are very helpful, which is great. Some we find great difficulty in coming down. Would it not set more of an example of you yourself, Secretary of State, accept some of the invitations that you've received from the Scottish Parliament?
Well, I have. I have appeared.
I think there's 2 outstanding invitations, I believe, that you were given.
Well, but they're not my brief. So, I mean, you know, there is no point inviting me to go and talk about someone that is another Secretary of State's responsibility, as I pointed out to them.
You could maybe send Lord Offord, given his enthusiasm to go there.
Well, he's got a great enthusiasm, but he wants to talk about trade deals, which is fine, and that is his brief. But I was asked to talk about something that would be cutting across another Whitehall Department's brief. And
DRS and GRR you were asked to. Was it not DRS and GRR?
So the DRS policy that's being drawn up now is being drawn up between DEFRA and the Scottish Government and the Welsh Government. And there's been detailed negotiations going on. For me to turn up and give my opinion would be completely wrong, because it would be cutting across what the Secretary of State is doing at DEFRA along with the Scottish Government. And it just wasn't a sensible thing for me to do, because and DEFRA didn't want me to do it. I mean, I said I would do it if they wanted me to, but they were very clear in saying that actually, you know, we're in detailed discussions. This is not the time for you to go and give your tuppence worth in front of a select committee.
We're keen to have this resolved, and I've floated the suggestion of a protocol and an arrangement between the 2 parliaments that would make available ministers for particular inquiries. Maybe you might support that.
I mean, I agree with that, Chairman, completely, but it has to be in the areas that you're responsible for. I think it's really important that you take responsibility for your portfolio, as I do with you here today.
I'm sure government colleagues have heard the enthusiasm of Lord Offord to appear before, and I'm pretty certain invitations will be winging his way.
Yeah, well, he'll give them a good lecture on trade deals, whether they like it or not.
David Duckett.
Thank you very much, Chair. Just to bring it back to the gender recognition reform in Section 35, if I may, could the application of Section 35 in that instance, do you think it could have been avoided by, I mean, it's obviously everything's easy with the benefit of hindsight, but do you think it could have been avoided with more engagement between the 2 governments, or
No.
No?
Yeah, well, I don't. I'll tell you why. I suppose it's not once bitten, twice shy, but we did try and engage with John Swinney on the UNCRC bill, and we were told that our engagement was not welcome. And I wrote to him and I explained that clauses 16 and 19 to 21 were out with the competence of the Scottish Parliament, and that, you know, he should withdraw those clauses and the bill would get through. Well, he told me that I can't remember the words he used, but something along the lines of mendacious in my interference or whatever. He stood up and said it, and because the letter made its way into the public domain, and I'm not accurately quoting it, but it was something along those lines. And they went forward and they included 6 and 19 to 21, and then I had to refer it to the Supreme Court, and they said that 6 and 19 to 21 are out of competence. And now we have the bill going through the Scottish Parliament last week, guess what, 2 years later, without clauses 6 and 19 to 21. So it's all come to pass years later with an awful lot of money being spent, taxpayers' money being spent in the courts, which is something I didn't, we didn't claim our costs, but there was costs for us and costs for the Scottish Government, totally unnecessary. So when it came to gender recognition, and we saw the number of amendments that were down and the potential, some of those amendments, if they'd been accepted, would have the potential effect they'd have on the bill, there was no need for us to, there was no, not need, there was no opportunity for us to get involved, nor after our experience with the UNCRC did we feel our involvement would be welcome, if I can put it that way, when we'd already been slapped down when we tried to help the last time.
Yeah, thanks. And as we've already heard, the Court of Session has ruled that the UK government acted lawfully when it did apply, or when you applied, Section 35 to that bill.
Can I correct it? So Lady Haldane said that I acted lawfully, rationally and reasonably. I was quite pleased with that.
Okay, that's now on record. Well done for that. But as soon as we heard that news, not long after we heard the news, the First Minister declared, I think he said something along the lines of that this was a dark day for devolution. So how does the application of Section 35 actually go against devolution?
Well, as you know, I think it strengthens the devolved settlement. I think it strengthens devolution because it means that devolved administrations don't pass legislation that upsets the equilibrium and has adverse effects on legislation that is UK or GB wide. So I think it is there to strengthen devolution. And I think that's what the founding fathers of devolution believed. And I know, as I said earlier to the chairman, all political parties voted for it at the time. So I don't think it in any way is a dark day for devolution. Quite the contrary. I think it shows that devolution can work and does work. And it's been a very rare occurrence to use Section 35. It's not a decision we took lightly, I can assure you of that. But it was the right decision to take. And consequently, I think future legislation will be better scrutinised by the law officers in Scotland, and as a result, and if the politicians are listening, the government are listening to the law officers, I think we will have better legislation coming forward.
And as it's often reported, the use of Section 35, you said it was used rarely. I think this is the only time it has been used.
Yeah.
It's often regarded as, well, reported as being unprecedented.
Yeah.
I think can you just clarify what you said earlier, that Section 35 in the 1998 Scotland Act has been there from the very beginning?
Yeah, it's been there from the very beginning, and along with Section 33, which does a different job. So Section 33 is for legislation that's out with the competence of the Parliament, and Section 35 is for legislation that has adverse effects on GB or UK-wide legislation.
Okay, thanks. Final question on Section 35. You'll be glad to hear. I'm sure you don't want to talk about it any more than you have to.
No, this is one of my favourite subjects at the moment, you can imagine.
So what happens next in terms of the legal process? Or what should happen next, in your opinion?
Well, there's an interlocutor, so we're now in a period of appeal. It's 21 days, so I think it ends on the 29th of December, and the Scottish Government have the ability to launch an appeal in that time if they desire to. I think they've, to date, kept their options open. I would urge them not to appeal. I think it was such a strong judgment in the UK government's favour. I think it'd be a terrible mistake to appeal, a terrible waste of taxpayers' money. I said that on Friday when I was being interviewed. My fear is that the First Minister is held to ransom by his Green Coalition partners. I've noted some of his SNP colleagues, the chairman would be one, and Kate Forbes would be another, have said that he shouldn't appeal and he should let the matter drop. I would agree with them. I think if he is bullied by Patrick Harvey, Lorna Slater and Ross Greer, that is a weakness on his behalf and will lead to an utter waste of taxpayers' money at a time when they're saying they've got budget constraints. It would make no sense to me whatsoever.
Thanks. No more questions?
Just on that, I mean, I was looking a little bit at the history there just when you were responding to Mr Duke. And it was the Tories that opposed Section 35 during the progress of the Scotland Act. And I remember, and I just sought out the quote there from Michael Ancram described it as the Governor-General power. Well, is that what you're exercising, the Governor-General power?
The irony of that, and I think that may be taken slightly out of context, but as most of your colleagues now call me Viceroy, I don't know if I've moved up a gear or down a gear, I'm not sure.
I think Governor-General sort of trumps that a little
I don't know.
bit.
Does it? I don't know. I'll take either. I mean, it's just amuses me. It amuses me more than anything else. The reality is, I was.
Do you not think it is ironic the fact?
No, there is an irony that, as you say, Michael Ancram made that comment. I haven't read it in its full context, but the reality is, this decision was taken not because I just wanted to wield a power that existed, but because I was advised there were adverse effects to the GB-wide equality legislation, pure and simple. And I mean, you know, there was no culture war here or desire to use a power for the sake of it or anything else. This was a very tough decision that we took based on strong legal advice, and that strong legal advice has been borne out.
Interesting you use the term culture war.
Well, because I was accused of that at the time, and it wasn't that. It's not absolutely not. The fact that it was a gender recognition reform bill was a matter of regret to me, and I said that at the time. Because I know that there are a minority there who will feel very sore about what's happened, and I appreciate that. But the reality was, this was entirely about the legal advice, nothing else.
It was nothing to do with the politics of the situations and the opportunities that are presented to you to stoke those particular culture wars.
No, and nor would I take a decision on that basis. I would only ever take, and it was the same with the Section 33s, I will only take the decision if I have very strong legal advice. And actually, you know, as I said at the time of when the new First Minister came in, you know, I did suggest to him that our legal advice was very strong, and I felt it was a waste of taxpayers' money to appeal the judgment.
Okay, thank you. Just say to colleagues, sorry, Mr. Lamont wants to comment.
I just wanted to add, Chairman, I mean, there's been some narrative, particularly from some nationalist commentators and MSPs and MPs, that the court ruling last week was in some way made by some external body to Scotland. I mean, it's important to record that this was a decision of a Scottish court. I mean,
who said that there was?
This is just a feeling that this was some sort of attack on the devolution settlement. This is the judiciary of Scotland upholding the Scotland Act of 1998. There's no third party making an intervention here. This is the Scottish judiciary, the Scottish court, making a determination
in Edinburgh.
In Edinburgh.
I've heard many things said about it, but I've not heard that. But thank you for that. And just to say to colleagues, we have got more time because our Liberal colleagues were particularly generous with their time. So if there's any interventions anybody wants to make, please come in. Christine, I know that if you want to see, if you're going to be here, if there's anything further you want to question, there now is the opportunity to do that. And right on cue.
Yeah, well, it's just on Section 35, not on the particular case, but on the principles of Section 35. Following the court case and everything that happened, there was some, I would say, confusion, particularly in the coverage of the fact it's going to be a Section 35. How did it differ from Section 33, which is about competence? Is there any need, do you think, to have a clarification of exactly which section applies to what, so that we don't get into a situation where we have an argument about whether it's competent to go for a Section 35 in the way that we had, where and now we're still, to a certain extent, debating in public whether it was competent for the government to call for a Section 35 order, when in fact, as you pointed out, it was in the original Act. It's been there all along. And the fact that it hasn't been used until now has possibly led people to neglect the fact that it was there and that it's quite acceptable to use.
I'm going to let Lawrence answer, but before, I mean, I think there's something in what you say, in as much as it hadn't been used in 23, 24 years, and I think that did, and it was something that was never really talked about, speculated about, part of commentary or press speculation or anything else. So that there has been a lot of explaining. And I think I've explained a few times today about the difference between it being beyond competence and adverse effect. But Lawrence, I think you want to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a fair observation that there's a degree of confusion, and I think that would include sort of parliamentarians and stakeholders. And so kind of being clear and communicating the differences, I think, would be helpful in that space. I think I would observe a bit of caution for the public at large, given probably a third of the Scottish population don't necessarily know that health is devolved, for example. The realism of getting those complicated messages across to the public in general, I think, is probably reasonably limited. But I think in terms of opinion formers and decision makers, I think that as an ongoing, more communication would be helpful.
And is there, do you think, any argument for a formal dispute resolution mechanism, particularly when it comes to something like the Internal Markets Bill? Should there be a sort of formal resolution mechanism?
You take, well, yes. We have the Minister for the Internal Market here.
When it comes to UKIM, there's a new body being set up called the Office of the Internal Market, completely independent body under the CMA, Competition Markets Authority, which in the ordinary course will examine where there's divergence happening and will take evidence on that. And you might say take the politics out of it. If we're actually saying that everyone understands that a single market works, right? And in fact, the Scottish Government are very in favour of a single market when it comes to the EU. Well, the same thing applies for the UK, that because we now have 4 administrations, we need a single market to make sure that we don't diverge on trade, especially on trade. And so therefore, if the presumption is that we're all going to do everything together on the same basis, like we drive on the same side of the road and we have the same time zone, for example, it's just a basic premise that we operate in the United Kingdom as one body. But that if there are particular exceptional circumstances required, that can be looked at and evidence can be given to that. So I would hope that now that the OIM has been constituted, has a chairman and a panel, I would hope that they will make a contribution to that, looking at these things in advance and taking what you might say some of the sting out of those matters.
Okay. One tiny point, last point, is maybe to oversimplify things, but the question about the UK government's right to use a Section 35 order. If you compare that with the fact that we take for granted the Scottish government's right to call in a planning application, are we perhaps overlooking that is simply the way the government works? When you have different spheres of government, that they have a right to question and call in other decisions?
I think that's absolutely right. And what we know from previous Section 33 interventions and this single Section 35 intervention is the Supreme Court in the case of Section 33 and now the Court of Session in Edinburgh on the Section 35, they see these parts of the Scotland Act as cemented into the Scotland Act. To them, to the judges, it is not unusual. It's not an unfettered power, as they correctly said, but if it's a power that, if correctly applied, is there as to protect the devolution settlement, not to undermine it, and they were very clear about that.
Simply process.
Thank you. Douglas Ross.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, Secretary of State, Ministers and Mr Rocky. And given the luxury of the time we have with the Secretary of State being so generous, I make a commitment not to cut you off at any point as you are trying to answer Secretary of State, as we've heard already this afternoon. If I can continue with Section 35 to begin with. In terms of going back to the Scotland Act, can it ever, Section 35, ever be described as unprecedented when it was actually inserted into the legislation forming the Scottish Parliament? How could it possibly be unprecedented if it was written into the legislation?
Yes, no. I think the use of there was no so the precedent was there because it was in the legislation. I get your technicality. I think when we talk about it being the use of it being unprecedented, just means it was the first time that it had ever been used. But the precedent was absolutely in the Scotland Act from 1998.
And that was set by a Labour government supported by the SNP
yes.
and other parties.
Yes.
And at that opportunity, at that point, they had the opportunity to say no. This could be an overreach by Westminster government on a new parliament that was about to be formed, but the 6 SNP MPs at the time were content to support the Section 35 element being included
yes.
in the Scotland Act.
Yes, and it was critical in the eyes of, I would say, in the eyes of the courts now that we know that it's there, because where there is adverse effect on UK or GB-wide legislation, there has to be the ability to put a stop to that, so we don't end up in a muddle across the United Kingdom with our laws. And ultimately, and I know the nationalists don't like me saying this, but this Parliament is sovereign. The Westminster Parliament is sovereign.
We know it.
And so again, Chairman?
No, just
He said, don't we know it?
You do indeed know it, Mr. Chairman. It's why I said, and you may not like it, but it is sovereign. And we saw that again, for instance, when the former First Minister took the UK government to court over who had the right under the Constitution. And just as I talked earlier about foreign affairs and the foreign affairs being reserved to the United Kingdom Parliament, the Constitution is reserved. And that victory that we had in the Supreme Court wasn't just a 100% victory. I mean, it was overwhelming. I mean, 100% is as far as you can go in percentage terms, I understand that, but it was overwhelming in as much as not only did the judges find in favour of the UK government's position and completely against the Scottish government's position, but others had decided to petition in as well, alongside the Scottish government, and they also were well and truly defeated. And it was a very strong victory. And I go back to the Chairman's former remarks, sort of inferring I might be some sort of Governor General. Well, in there, the SNP papers had suggested that Scotland Scotland was an oppressed colony, and of course that's laughable in itself. But the Supreme Court judges said in no way was Scotland an oppressed colony, far from it. And as a UK government, we give huge support to Scotland, record block grants, and record spending numbers, £1.20 for every pound in England, etc., etc. And we're all in this together, and we all pull along together. And what we aren't doing is throwing our weight about. All we're trying to do is produce legislation that works for the whole United Kingdom.
I'm keen to come on to the budget in a moment, but sticking with Section 35, the Chair mentioned reports or concerns that you were stoking division and going after culture issues. Well, Lady Haldane was very clear not to get involved in the politics. She did, as I understand it, dismiss that argument from the Scottish Government. Is that correct?
Correct.
Yeah. In terms of, again, the question that the Chair put to you but then didn't allow you to answer, you were keen to explain that during the process of the bill there were several amendments. Now, I come at this from someone who sits in both parliaments and voted on each and every one of these amendments. Can you maybe explain, because the Chair did cut you off, about how it would have been possible or otherwise to have discussions with the Scottish Government about an incomplete bill that had the potential to change right up until just over a year ago from this date?
Well, it wasn't possible to have those discussions, and it wouldn't be right for me to tell them which amendments they should pass or not pass. It's for the Scottish Parliament to make their legislation, to make it competent, and then it goes for royal assent. It's only where it's incompetent, either due being out, beyond their competence in a Section 33, or having adverse effects on UK GB legislation in Section 35, where the law officers will advise me to step in. And it's not for me to tell the Scottish Parliament how to produce or make their legislation. As we saw with UNCRC, when I did suggest clauses 6 and 19 to 21 were beyond their competence, John Swinney was very quick to slap me down. And now, guess what? Finally, 2 years later, the legislation has gone through and those clauses have been removed. So we can help them. The law officers here can help them, but it's not well received. And if that's the case, it's entirely incumbent on them to make the legislation, make it good, and then it will go seamlessly for royal assent.
And that was the immediate criticism from Fiona Robertson at the time, the Cabinet Secretary who was leading this through. When you announced that you were taking forward a Section 35 order, she said this was the first they had heard about it. But because that bill was being changed, and I don't think it would have made the bill perfect, but it would have put in certain safeguards that it would have improved potentially flawed legislation. Until that bill had passed, you couldn't then consider it.
No, those amendments, at stages 2 and 3, we couldn't determine which ones would get through and which ones wouldn't, and it wasn't for us to interfere. And we didn't rush out to judgment either. I mean, I think the legislation from memory went through on the 21st or 22nd of December. And I think I invoked the Section 35 on the 17th of January. So, there was a time of reflection, getting proper legal advice, and then coming to that decision. It wasn't a premeditated decision.
You've discussed already the cost of this and actually other cases that the Scottish Government have taken the UK Government to court on fairly recently. I think you said today and on Friday that the Scottish Government should not appeal this because of the cost to Scottish taxpayers, and I fully support this, that position.
Yes.
What is the cost for UK Government, Scottish Government of this particular legal battle, and the reports in the press over the weekend that you are considering seeking costs from the Scottish Government? Can you advise us on that?
I mean, my understanding, and I don't have the precise figures, is that the Scottish Government have spent £230,000. We have spent circa £150,000 on our legal advice. If this was to go to the inner court of session, you could easily double that up. And if it was to then go to the Supreme Court, you could double that again. So it's a sort of exponential increase. You could easily end up at the thick end of £2 million. But what I would say is this, is that, I'm talking to my legal officers now about seeking costs. And I think the UK government, we've had enough court cases. And there were commentators and those who said that I should have sought costs after Nicola Sturgeon brought her unsuccessful referendum, constitutional, who's got the right to hold a referendum challenge. We didn't do that at the time. I think this time I'm minded, as you may have read in the, I don't know, but you may have read in the press, I am minded to seek costs from the Scottish Government, and I am having those discussions with our law officers.
Thank you. And finally on Section 35, before I move on to other issues, Mr Ducat mentioned some of the response from the First Minister. Now, clearly Humza Yousaf is the leader of the SNP, but he did say when he was seeking support in the Scottish Parliament to be elected as First Minister, he would seek to work for the whole of Scotland and all Scots. His response said, "This judgment shows that devolution is fundamentally flawed. These are dark days for devolution, and a court has confirmed that legislation passed by Holyrood can be struck down by Westminster." Does the Secretary of State agree with me that none of that is actually true and it's a gross misunderstanding of the ruling, the legislation and the devolution settlement?
Yeah, I think it's totally misleading and totally inaccurate. And he also said in one of his statements that he fully respected the judgment of the court, but those previous remarks he made didn't respect the judgment of the court, and therefore he made no sense.
Can I move on to the other issue that the Chair spoke about at some length, the letter from the Foreign Secretary over the weekend. In terms of the correspondence and any subsequent response, what has been the UK Government's immediate view on the response from the First Minister when he was interviewed about this today, and some of the arguments he gives against letters such as this, which I think he called petty, being issued to the Scottish Government?
Well, this isn't the first letter. I think I made that clear. I think it was on the 14th or the 16th of October, the then Foreign Secretary James Cleverly sent a letter because the Scottish Government had resisted having a Foreign Office official in the room for the First Minister's meeting with the Icelandic Prime Minister. And there have been examples in the past, and we have talked about this in the past. There is a pattern here. It's quite clear the protocols are for foreign affairs that, well, two things really. The first thing is that if you, as I've said, if you are visiting and meeting foreign ministers, and that meeting has been facilitated and is logistically put in place as well by our embassies, our posts, then you have a Foreign Office official present to take notes, to record the meeting, so there's no confusion as to what was said. That is, it's a very high-level, long-standing protocol, and ministers in the United Kingdom, whether Devolve administration or UK government, adhere to that, and that is important. There's also another piece here which I've been very clear about in the past, and that is when meeting governments and ministers in other countries, we speak as one voice. It is a reserved matter. a different foreign policy from a devolved administration is not something that we agree with. It is a reserved matter in the Scotland Act, as is the Constitution a reserved matter in the Scotland Act. And it's important, we believe, that that is respected.
And the Foreign Secretary's letter is very clear. You are making the example of what is expected of you as a and your ministers when they go abroad. But actually this guidance is for devolved government ministers on overseas visits. So it's not just saying we're taking what's provided to the UK government ministers and telling you there is a separate guidance. It will be very similar, but it is designed for devolved government ministers. Yeah. And I wonder if I can just confirm that you gave in your evidence to the Chief.
I should point out that UK government ministers must adhere to, irrespective of whether they work for the Foreign Office or any other department, they must adhere to those rules as well.
Yeah. But you gave 4 further examples of meetings held at COP28 between the First Minister and the Prime Minister of Lebanon, the Acting Prime Minister of Pakistan, the President of the European Commission and the President of the European Council. Did any of those meetings have a Foreign Office official present? So it's not just that these meetings took place, but they were also in breach of the guidance which is outlined in this letter?
Yes.
So was there any notification to the Foreign Office that these meetings would happen, or is your knowledge about these meetings simply...
I would have to check on that, but on the basis that they were picked up on the First Minister's Twitter account, I suspect not.
So no notification, unlikely to be any notification, and certainly no Foreign Office.
I'm not going to go 100% on that, but they were picked up on his Twitter account. So my suspicion is not, but we can write you on that.
Thank you. You said in your opening remark about the funding settlement to the Scottish Government and £545 million extra over the next couple of years coming to the Scottish Government. How does that then, that statement from you, correspond to what the Deputy First Minister said to me in the Scottish Parliament a couple of weeks ago when she was standing in for Humza Yousaf when he was at COP28? We had a discussion about a number of issues, and she said in a quote from the Scottish Parliament website here, Douglas Ross has had nothing to say about an autumn statement that has given no money whatsoever for public services for this government, for this country, for our public services for next year. Was any of that true?
No.
No. So it's completely false.
Yeah, it's completely false. I mean, the Treasury have declared, have published the figures and the details all there. It's £545 million of Barnett consequentials.
If you get through 2 years, it's £1 billion. If you take the last 2 years of Barnett consequentials,
it's £1 billion.
It's £1 billion. It's £1 billion, and it protects the settlement for the 3 devolved administrations being 20% higher than in England, and the Welsh Government have declared that they think it's a very fair settlement.
Just on the budget, there's also been a very successful scheme in England and Wales for 75% rates relief for hospitality, tourism and retail. Last year, the Barnett consequentials went from the UK Government to the Scottish Government. They chose not to pass that on to these vital organisations and sectors. There is significant concern, particularly amongst hospitality, and I met with Stephen Montgomery of the Scottish Hospitality Group just last week, that they are again not going to receive that funding. Now, clearly the UK Government gives the Scottish Government a significant amount of money, and it's up to them to spend it. I wonder, as a Scottish MP, and Mr Lamont might want to come in here as well, how important would it be that the Scottish Government do pass on that full 75% rates relief for the businesses that didn't get it last year and are desperate for it this year?
Well, I would say very important, but you may want to add to that, do you, John?
I just would agree. I mean, I think that there's a growing frustration that there's additional funding
coming to Scotland from this United Kingdom government, which not only businesses and employers don't see the benefit of in Scotland because the Scottish Government decides to hang on to it. Local authorities in Scotland are also crying out for additional funding, so they don't see the benefit of the huge block grant which Scotland's getting. All they see is their budgets getting cut more and more by the Scottish Government. So I share your frustration.
I would add to that, if you don't mind, that actually this basically demonstrates what a fair, and you might even say generous settlement, the devolution system we have in this country. You wouldn't see this in Germany or US in a federal system where Berlin would send money to the Landes without any scrutiny or accountability. And that certainly doesn't happen in the US federal system. So effectively what's happening here is the money goes to Edinburgh with no strings attached. It's up to the Scottish Government to decide what their priorities are. Now, if they decide their priorities are to give record pay settlements to the public sector, or they decide to make record welfare and benefit payments, they are entitled to do that. But if the result of that is that there's a big funding squeeze on local authorities, on the police, on education, that is for the Scottish Government to decide. There's nothing to do with Westminster. It's entirely to do with the priorities of the Scottish Government, and they must then, when they come to the budget coming up, they've made their decisions, they must put their hand up and own their decisions and take accountability for their decisions.
Yeah. Two quick issues, if I can, to finish on. Wendy Chamberlain was mentioning a health group that hadn't met, and we got some clarification, I think, from Mr Rocky that hopefully they have. There's been coverage in the Scottish media in the last week of the disgraced Health Secretary in Scotland, still shamefully in position despite his claim of £11,000 of taxpayers' money, but he refused a genuine offer from the UK Government to assist to reduce waiting times in Scotland. I wonder what your response is as part of the Scotland office. I know this came from a former Health Secretary, but it was a generous offer, and I've certainly got constituents who can't understand why they can't be seen in Scotland. They see this offer made to potentially get them seen quicker using the resources of the United Kingdom, and that's snubbed by the SNP.
I mean, I'm baffled by that, and I see, you know, living where I do, near the border in Dumfries and Galloway, I see things going on between, you know, when the floods happened in Carlisle, the Dumfries and Galloway ambulances went and helped, and that's been reciprocated. I know people come, you know, there's people going backwards and forwards to get special treatment on certain things. There are, you know, if you come back with some sort of foreign tropical disease, some tropical disease, we don't have a tropical disease facility in Scotland, and you'll be treated in Liverpool or London. Or, you know, there is reciprocation going on all the time, and there's reciprocation obviously with organ donation, and on it goes. And why he would have turned down that help to reduce waiting times is beyond me. I mean, I'm absolutely baffled by it.
So I would agree with that entirely, and as you know, Mr Ross, I represent a Borders constituency as well, and increasingly I'm finding local residents who they might be registered with a beric practice in England who are receiving treatment much more quickly compared to their neighbours who are registered with GP practices in Scotland. Over the last few years, there's also been an increasing trend where it used to be quite easy to get treatment south of the border because it was more practical and easy. If you live in the far east or the far west of the borders, it would make more sense to go to Carlisle or Berwick to get treatment. And increasingly, because of what we're told is direction from the Scottish Government, treatment must be provided in Scotland. That adds to waiting times. It makes it more practically more difficult for patients to access treatment. So a whole variety of levels, it's becoming much more difficult to access health services in Scotland. But I share your frustration with the Scottish Government's failure to engage with the UK Government to try and alleviate that.
And the final topic I wanted to raise is with you, Minister Lamont, in terms of UK Government funding in Scotland. And we had a very successful visit when you came up to Murray and visited a number of organisations in forests who have benefited from various different UK Government funds. Would you briefly be able to outline some of that investment? And while we've been in our meeting this afternoon, Michelle Gillibrand, who you met in Forest Town Hall, has been in touch to seek a further meeting with you if I'm able to facilitate that, and I thought what better way to make that bid and offer at this session. So hopefully you and your officials will be able to meet with myself and Michelle about some issues they've got, but generally on the funding going from the UK Government to Scotland.
Mr Ross, I'm always very happy to meet your constituents. I'll have a think about meeting you again, but I was delighted to see some of the projects that have been supported in your own constituency a few weeks ago. They are just a number of examples across Scotland of where the UK Government has been investing directly into local areas. I think it equates to £2.7 billion now across the whole of Scotland through the Growth Deal, Levelling Up Fund, Community Ownership Fund, Green Free Ports, Community Renewal Fund, UK Share Prosperity Fund, and a whole variety of other initiatives. I've been particularly keen and delighted to see some of the investment in sporting facilities, again, which is one I was able to see in your own area. Grassroots sports are a key part of ensuring that young people get a good start in life, and I'm pleased the UK UK government is keen to do that. I think one of my frustrations has been during the year in this job is when you see this money, this UK government money, going directly into communities across Scotland, which is undoubtedly benefiting the people that we represent, and we hear SNP members complaining about this as being this sort of attack on devolution or other attack lines. And for the people who are benefiting, for the communities who are benefiting from this, they're completely baffled by this line of attack. All they see is their communities benefiting from this UK funding coming into their areas. And I think we should all be welcoming it.
And finally, there is always great interest when we have the Secretary of State with the Scotland Office Ministers at this meeting. There's been live reporting done from within the committee room today by Andrew Quinn, the political reporter down here in Westminster for the Daily Record. Now, there are numerous concerns about job cuts within media across the UK, Scottish media, and particularly the print media. Would you agree, whatever we think about individual stories that go into the papers, a robust reporting of our activities as Scottish MPs down here at Westminster is vital, and yes, there is and should be concern about repeated cuts to that element of the media in Scotland?
Absolutely. Totally agree.
Yes, I agree as well. I mean, in my own area in the Borders, I used to have 7 or 8 local newspapers and come down to 3 or 4. One of them is a great success story, the Hoyk paper, which is a relatively new addition to the array of local papers which are holding me to account and all the other elected representatives. I think it's a key part of our local democracy.
Thank you all. I think we all agree on that one, and Andrew's been a fantastic asset in covering Scottish political affairs down in Westminster.
Well, I haven't read what he's live tweeted yet before I agree to that, but I hope you're right.
Chairman, can I just follow up on one of the points that...
No, of course. I think...
If we can move on, because I think we're trying to be as equitable as possible with time allocation.
So, just ask the Secretary, what's his understanding of the current inflation rate just now? What's the average inflation rate been across the UK this year?
That's for you.
Well, inflation is down to below 5%, 4.7%. It was at a high of 11.4%. And I can tell you it's the same in Germany and Australia.
Okay,
it's not a UK issue.
So we've had stuff about the Scottish budget, so we just heard there inflation is now down to 5% from that high of 11%. But when we look at the block grant, so 23-24 block grant is 36.9 billion, and then 24-25 it's 37.4 billion. So that's an increase of 1.4%. So quite clearly 1.4% is way below the current 5% inflation. So that's a real terms cut, isn't it, to the Scottish block grant?
So inflation works across the whole United Kingdom. So there's no one particular part isolated from inflation. Okay, the budget that we set at 41 billion is a record budget. You take the Barnett consequentials that come through, that's an extra billion. And the Welsh Government themselves said that when they looked at the numbers given, it's an extra 15 billion euro on average.
Well, I'm
works out at 8.5 for Scotland.
Budget, it only goes up 1.4% next year, so that's a real terms cut, isn't it? That's undeniable compared to inflation rate.
If you then take the Barnett consequentials, they alleviate. We've then cut inflation is now down below.
Barnett's a one-off on the current, and the Barnett next year is only 0.6%. So even account for Barnett, the budget only goes up 2%.
And in the meantime, we've looked after the most vulnerable people in our society. Our pensions have gone up in line with inflation at the 10% rate. Universal benefits gone up in line with inflation.
Just answer the question and confirm.
The minimum wage has gone up.
2% increase in the budget, it still represents a real terms cut. That's just a fact, isn't it?
The reality is that all the budgets are going through the same process, and the Scottish Government and the Welsh Government and the Irish Government get £120 spent on them in devolved administrations versus £100 in England. It's a very generous settlement.
It's a real terms cut. The scrutiny unit, when they analysed spending the block grant allocations since 2010, they've actually confirmed that it's now a 17% real terms cut compared to 2010. So you might be factually correct when you talk about a record settlement, but the reality is that record settlement, because clearly if a budget increases, you're always going to hit a new record settlement, but it's a 17% real terms cut since 2010. So isn't that putting pressure on the Scottish Government?
Scottish Government spending in the last 5 years, it's gone from 40 billion to 56 billion. That is an increase of 7% per annum. That is not austerity.
So a 17% real terms cut, that's from the scrutiny unit. You're saying that's not austerity?
I'm saying 7% increase in the budget over the last 5 years, when in the previous 4 years there was no inflation, zero inflation. 7% per annum is the most generous funding settlement in the UK. That is not austerity.
So you're saying 17% cut since 2010 in real terms isn't austerity? It's quite clear.
I'm saying that it's quite clear that in the funding round, there's been no austerity in Scotland. There's been a generous funding.
It's a real terms cut. I mean, I've gave you the figures. So that's a fact. It's a real terms cut. But if we move on, we look at the capital grant. The capital grant is going to decrease from 6.2 billion down to 5.6 billion. That's a 10% cut. So why is there a 10% cut to the capital expenditure budget given to the Scottish Government?
The capital, that is done in the round. It's done in the fiscal framework. It's done on an overall basis. In the meantime, the borrowing limits have been maintained for Scotland.
Why the cut?
The cut on the capital grant, I'm not aware of the detail of that. We'll get into I'm very happy to get into the detail of that with you offline.
Well, we'll write to you.
Right to me explain.
Yeah, we'll write to you because you're going through detail. You're quoting something scrutiny. Did you call it?
Scrutiny unit. Yeah.
Scrutiny unit. Who are they?
It's a part.
It's a what?
Part of the parliamentary process. So you should know who the scrutiny unit is.
The scrutiny unit have given you figures.
Yep.
Okay. Well, if you supply them to us, we will analyse them because the figures we have for Her Majesty's Treasury say that the current block grant of 41.6 billion is, in real terms, the highest since devolution began. So we will.
We've covered that. Cause
you're not liking the answer. But you've cherry-picked, Alan. Let's be clear. You've cherry-picked 2010. Our figures that we quoted that you were contradicting are since 1999. So and as Lord Offord said, we've just been through a period of no inflation for a number of years. So let's get you the accurate figures as quoted by the Treasury.
So let's do that and we'll move on now, if that's okay.
Well, you can, but I'm just trying to put a balance in. That's all.
It's quite often described. The Scottish Parliament is described as the most powerful devolved Parliament in the world. Do you still think that's the case?
Yes.
Yeah. So, Northern Ireland, welfare is devolved to the Northern Ireland Assembly. Energy policy is devolved to the Northern Ireland Assembly, and civil service is devolved to the Northern Ireland Assembly. So, quite clearly, the Northern Ireland Assembly has got more powers than the Scottish Parliament. So, how can the Scottish Parliament be deemed the most powerful devolved Parliament in the world?
Well, there's a number of, I think it was 13 welfare benefits that were planned to be sent to the Scottish Government. I think only 3 of them have been implemented so far. So there's been plenty of ability.
Why is full devolution of welfare to Northern Ireland good enough for Northern Ireland but not good enough for the Scottish Parliament? Why is energy policy devolved to Northern Ireland but not to the Scottish Parliament? Why is that?
That is the settlement that is agreed with the United Kingdom. Energy is a devolved matter. We are on one island. We work in one geography, and we have to solve the energy crisis together.
And Northern Ireland, obviously, there's a relationship between energy between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, which is not part of the United Kingdom. So that explains that part. But it is still the most powerful Parliament. The Scottish Parliament has more powers than in the round collectively than any of the other devolved legislatures. And for instance, the police in Wales is still reserved to the UK government. The police in Scotland is devolved. I mean, there are many things that are devolved to the Scottish Parliament that aren't fully devolved to Wales. So you're just cherry-picking things that suit your argument. But I think you know that the Scottish Parliament has got enormous powers and not least tax-bearing powers.
Look further afield, like in Canada, some of the Canadian provinces have got their own immigration policy. So why couldn't Scotland have its own immigration policy?
Because we are one United Kingdom. Well, one United Kingdom, we need a central policy on key matters, whether it's foreign affairs, whether it's energy, whether it's constitution, whether it's immigration. We're joined on one island. We cannot have differentiating policies on immigration.
couldn't trust the Scottish Parliament to have a different policy.
It's common sense.
What we're trying to do is not have an economic border within the United Kingdom. That's why immigration is reserved.
Previously, there's a fresh talent scheme. Well, obviously, that was under a Labour government, but that managed to operate a separate immigration policy for Scotland, and that worked. So why can't something like that be looked at again?
We believe, you know very well the UK government's position. We believe that immigration should be reserved, and we should have one policy across the United Kingdom, and we're very clear about that. And I know it's something that isn't necessarily popular with the Scottish government, but it's something we believe is important. And we have mitigating factors like the seasonal agricultural workers scheme, which works very well for the whole of the UK. This office took it from 2,500 to 30,000 people. It's now increased since then. It does the job it's meant to do. It works on a UK-wide basis. Those people arrive in the Scilly Isles in February, March to pick daffodils, and they're picking fruit later in the year in Scotland, and they do other things on the way, and it's a lot of the same people moving across the country as seasonal agricultural workers before they then return.
Okay, we'll move on from that. Okay. Couple of energy matters. So I've been asking about a cap and floor revenue mechanism for pumped storage hydro for a number of years now. There's 2 schemes in Scotland that are ready to go. The private investment's there. All that's needed is this trading mechanism. Now, I believe there's maybe going to be another consultation, but why is this taking so long, and why doesn't the government just go on with it so we can get the pumped storage hydro up and running in Scotland with these new projects?
Lawrence. Is this Cruachan you're talking about? And
you've got Cruachan extension, and you've got Corrie Glass, which would be a new scheme.
Yep.
No, I mean, just to say, I think that the government recognises the potential and the importance, and is committed to having a framework in place by 2024. So we're still committed to that.
I mean, I would add that this office is amongst, we do believe they are good schemes, and we have pressed the case for that, but they are going through the consultation process, and I believe they're both excellent schemes that will be enabled.
I mean, I'd benefit of visiting Cruachan during the summer, so I fully recognise the importance to Scotland. But
and you know how keen they are to get up and running, and it's this lack of a mechanism that's holding things back. If look at another aspect of energy, so obviously the TUNIUS charges where Scotland's at a disadvantage by having to pay much higher grid connection fees. Yeah. So that does put Scottish projects at a disadvantage.
Scottish consumers get the benefit of equal pricing. There's 2 sides of the same coin, right?
I'm going to come to my point though. Yeah. So industry has started raising concerns that looking forward, they think that to connect the north of Scotland is going to be £20 per megawatt hour additional cost. Now that quite clearly means Scottish projects cannot therefore be competitive with ones further south, which actually then means consumers right across Great Britain are not going to get access to the lowest, cheapest forms of electricity generation. So what are you going to do about the possible impact of these charges?
So I'll answer that. I mean, as you will know, Mr Brown, Ofgem are carrying out a review of this area. We expect to hear results of that in 2025. But myself and Minister Bowie, the Energy Minister, recently chaired a joint meeting with the industry and Ofgem just to hear at first hand from them what their concerns are. And we're going to have another meeting in the new year. We've tasked Ofgem and others with various action points, and we hope to hear back in terms of how we might be able to address some of these concerns. But I mean, it is an Ofgem, matter.
Yeah, but government can't just wash their hands of it if it's going to disadvantage Scottish.
But the Chancellor said in his autumn statement, this is going to be a major area, Ofgem, and we've had meetings. I've attended the Islands Forum, the first one, which was in Orkney, and we had Ofgem on the line with the whole community there. And what's happening here as part of the transition is we need to redesign our grid system from when it used to be based on coal-fired power stations in Scunthorpe to now renewable energy in Orkney and Shetland and Kincardine. So this is part of the transition. Ofgem have to redesign the grid system. There's a huge amount of money being allocated to that.
Well, it's not Ofgem that designs the grid system, but in one other energy aspect. So post-Brexit, Energy UK estimated that the new trading arrangements for electricity is adding £1 billion a year to our electricity bills. So during a cost of living crisis, why does the government think that's acceptable for £1 billion to be added to our bills?
We don't accept that analysis. I mean, this government's put in a huge amount of support to help households and businesses with the...
Was Energy UK wrong? What
energy?
What do you think the additional costs are, the post-Brexit trading arrangement?
Well, Brexit gets blamed for all sorts of things, and the SNP are the first to point at Brexit for a whole catalogue of things. What this government is doing, what this government is doing is supporting households and businesses with the extra costs of energy. And I know from my constituents that's been a very welcome intervention, and we continue to support the most vulnerable households.
Will you write to the committee and explain what your assessment of the additional costs are post?
Mr Brown, Brexit gets blamed for all sorts of things.
It's a fact that the trading arrangements for electricity have changed and it adds costs. So I'm asking if you could write to the committee and confirm what that additional cost is.
As I say, Brexit gets blamed for many things.
I think it was a request to get some correspondence. I'm sure we'll get that for Mr Brown's satisfaction. Now, Mr Menz has just arrived. Are you okay just take a question from Mark? Yeah, is that all right? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Patiently. So,
thanks, Chair. I mean, I have to rush off to a DL, so I apologise, Secretary of State, for the late notice. But with regards to promoting Scotland internationally, a huge amount of work is currently going on, much of it unseen. But one of the initiatives that's come forward is a new Delivering for Scotland board. Could you share a bit more, of your thoughts on that and a bit more light?
Yes, so the Delivering for Scotland board is one that I chair and convene with the sort of lead officials in the Whitehall departments, and it is there to the lead non-exec director joins me, Tom Harris and Lawrence Rocky, obviously the director of the Scotland office, and what we're doing is making sure that the Whitehall departments are across the detail on matters that affect Scotland in legislation they're bringing forward, and we're looking for advice from them as well as solutions, and it is very much me as a politician sitting with civil servants and talking about what Whitehall is doing in that regard, and it's proving to be very effective, I think. I mean, it's a real asset. Mr Rocky might want to add to that.
I mean, just in one sentence, it's very much about joining the wiring up to make sure that Whitehall is thinking about Scotland as around rather than just the individual areas, and I think it's proven the feedback from my civil service colleagues from across departments has been very positive.
Yeah, a big focus on trade, but also including other areas as well.
Yeah, so it's the MOD, and obviously there's lots of in relation to Scotland on that. It's DEFRA, it's as you say, it's the Department for Business and Trade, it's everything, science, technology. It's all departments. The Foreign Office are there, the Home Office are there. Everyone is invited to it, and they all have to speak to their responsibilities and the roles, and then discussions happen and action points are taken forward.
Excellent. Chair, that's great. Thank you very much.
And thank you again, Secretary of State. I hope this isn't the last time that we'll see you in front of this committee and the election perhaps getting in the way of any further sessions. But if it is, I've always enjoyed our sessions. I think you've always been fully frank with this committee, and I think they've always been good-natured and very helpful. Indeed. And I know you mentioned you've been here, is it 7 times in the past?
Yes, I think so.
Let's hope we get it.
I look forward to it.
Great. Well, thank you again.
I know you do, Mr Chairman.
Indeed, and thank you for your time. Order, order.